first thing I did is I called up the Stop Hinkley people and said, is this a similar type of reactor? They said, it's the same. So here is Roy Pumphrey from Stop Hinkley talking about exactly this Taishan incident, where there's a release of what they call noble gases, which are basically radioactive gas from this reactor, which didn't behave as it was supposed to behave, as predicted and designed over in China. And this is what we can expect here on the Bristol Channel.
This should be EDF's flagship, because this is exactly the same model of a European pressurized water reactor. That's what it's called. And the one at Taishan is the first one they've actually managed to get to work. They started work in Finland and in France before they started work in Taishan. And even though Taishan was delayed, they did manage to get the Chinese manufacturer, builder, constructor, did manage to get Taishan up and working in a surprisingly short time, bearing in mind how they were struggling in Finland and France with exactly the same model reactor, which is exactly what they're putting into Hinkley C. That's why it's of interest, is because the first nuclear power station, the first reactor for a generation being built in the UK, is the same design as one that, after only been running for a couple of years, now seems to be problematic in China. And so there are a number of concerns. Firstly, this is happening in China, and the nuclear regulators in Finland and France and the UK can be taken to be a bit more objective and probably demanding and able to have some effect on what's actually happening. We know the French have thrown out some of the steel that was supposed to be going into the Flamanville, the French reactor, and we assume they'd be similarly assertive here. Over in China, I hesitate to say whether a Chinese nuclear regulator was actually going to be capable of taking on the government-backed building and the construction of a nuclear power station over there. So, and what's interesting is that although that's been going for a couple of years, and you would have thought that EDF would be making a great song and dance about the fact that, here, look, we've got one of these to work. I have to say that in the numerous meetings I've attended, EDF's own meetings locally, it's a dog that doesn't bark. They rarely, if ever, mention the fact that they've got one to work in China. They don't really want to talk about it. And now we get an indication of why that might be the case. In fact, it's not all going swimmingly in China after all.
As I understand it, part of the deal to switch this reactor on, if it ever gets finished, is that it's got to be shown to be working safely for a period of time elsewhere. Maybe that's in Finland or France or China.
France.
Is that? Oh, okay. So it's the French one. So the French one's got to be switched on. It's got to be working correctly with with no problems before the one at Hinkley is allowed to be switched on. So how close are they to switching the French one on even?
The last information we had was next year, but they have kept putting back that start date for quite a while, for years. And there's also concern that because of the problems with the steel, that they can only run it for a couple of years before they have to stop. So take it all and then take it apart and put new steel in. And that doesn't make any sense at all, because it's extremely costly, dangerous and time consuming. So I don't know. But the thing about Hinkley C is that and the reason we believe that EDF are throwing extra people at it desperately is because that has to be up and running by 2029, or that very generous deal that I've just referred to, that falls and something else happens. The government has at least got a deadline date, which we believe is 2029, for what happens here. And so that's as far as I understand it, that's the thing. There were some loans which EDF didn't take up, which were conditional on Flamanville running by last year, the French reactor running by last year, which it clearly wasn't. So it was very sensible of EDF not to make the government loans that they might have had to help them build Hinkley C, not to take those up, because they would have struggled with dealing with them because of the French plant not working.
So, just checking the news feeds here, Martin, there's no reference in the British news at all to the fact that this is highly likely to affect Hinkley C.
Well, you can imagine, it's, as you know, news agendas get dominated by what's happening in that week. And, nuclear power, although we follow it fairly closely here, and obviously the people, campaigners in Hinkley are following it closely, lots of other people are more worried about the England-Scotland game.
Well, yes, we're definitely competing with that. But then, of course, this is the sort of stuff that they love to churn out. It's everyone following the football rather than the fact that we may have a load of jobs go in Hinkley, and all the billions that have been spent on it already is a complete waste of money. But anyway, that's why we're here. We don't do sport. We do journalism here. Another thing, just quickly this week, Hinkley C, a fire has been confirmed at the plant after a smoke cloud was seen from Burnham-on-Sea. So tourists with their binoculars at Burnham-on-Sea noticed a whole load of smoke billowing out from the construction site, Martin. We didn't get a press release from EDF saying, I'm sorry, we've had a fire down here. It's basically the locals with their binoculars that are making the news nowadays.
Well, obviously, I mean, if they're having problems with it, as they clearly are, and, as we've discussed on previous shows, the economics of it just don't add up, then the less said the better from the point of view of EDF and the consortium that are building it.
Well, Devon and Somerset Fire and Rescue attended the plant this week after one of the galleries, which is used to run pipes and cables around the station, caught light. Well, that means, of course, all those pipes and cables will have to be replaced. That may set things back another 6 months or something.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you may be right. I do not know. I mean, obviously, the fundamentals here are that nuclear power, to my mind, has never been economically viable. And the only reason why the consortium that are building it agreed to build it was on the understanding that they would get a guaranteed price for the energy, which is far higher than the current market price. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. And, of course, it may well be that if they run out of time in the building process, then they won't get that market price, and the whole thing will just be a waste of money, if nothing else.
Reminded of insurance loss assessor I got as a contact years ago. This is in the mid-1990s, as I was doing my sort of jollying around Ireland in the south, and this was, I think, on the way to Cork, actually. He was an insurance loss assessor at 3 Mile Island in the States, and it is a similar sort of thing that happened that caused the reactor to melt down in 3 Mile Island. Was a problem with the pipes and the cables in one of the galleries at that station. It was the gallery connecting the control room to the reactor itself, and what had happened was the pressure had been evacuated from this pipe in order to make sure that there was no fire could take place. The only problem was that the valve failed, and it had failed for a while. No one was checking the valve, and then when there was a small electrical fire, it took off with whole loads of oxygen in there, and it just burnt, and so it got rid of the ability of the people who were running that station to actually to slow the reactor down when it started getting hotter. So it's just started getting hotter and hotter and hotter and melted down. Of course, at that point, all the staff jump in their cars, helicopters, etc., and do a runner, because there's nothing you can do. So we've got a similar sort of system also is going on with the hacking of the plants, the reactors in Iran, where actually this is not happening through a fire accident, but it's being done deliberately using something like the Stuxnet virus.
Yeah, and I'm also reminded of what happened at Chernobyl and Fukushima. I mean, all of these things are straws in the wind, as I say. I mean, the Chinese and the French committed to producing energy through nuclear power years ago, and the Japanese, for similar reasons, because they don't want to be dependent on oil. They haven't got a lot of oil. And, you know, if you might be able to buy oil in the world market at certain prices, but of course if there's a war or something like that, then you won't be able to.
Well,
so in other words, the decision to make nuclear power has some strategic.
The Middle East. Well, okay, the Middle East is where the oil comes from. So if there's a war in the Middle East, which seems to be being cooked up all the time, then it makes sense to have renewable wind power and probably nuclear, because you're not going to have any oil anymore.
That's right. So the decision about nuclear power, ostensibly, it really doesn't add up. I mean, that's one of the things that's killed it off, basically.
You mean the green because it's been said it's carbon neutral.
Well, yeah, well, that's just...
Although it's not.
Well, I mean, to build a nuclear power station is not carbon neutral, is it? You're using masses of concrete, petrol, etc. So, in a sense, that's a bit of a red herring. In other words, that's a kind of justification for what you want to do anyway. But countries like China and Japan and France have gone for nuclear power for strategic reasons, which is because it doesn't really add up economically as things stand. But of course, once you've committed yourself to building them, and there are plenty of functional nuclear power stations in China and in France. And as long as they're not losing too much money, you keep them running because you've invested so much.
Is this a bit of I remember Jacob Rees-Mogg saying, well, actually, we're not going to do HS2, even though, of course, they're now committed to doing it. And these politicians do tend to change their minds. But he was saying, well, it doesn't matter that we've already spent money on it, because we need to just pull the plug now. Otherwise, we'll be spending loads more money on it and wasting that money. Anyway, you're absolutely right about the dubiousness of the environmental credentials of something like Hinkley, and I spoke to Allan Jeffrey last week about this, and this is because there are increasingly these groups out there which are part of the UK and Welsh Green Party, which are very pro-nuclear. They argue that we must do nuclear and we must do it now. They say it's a zero carbon source of energy, but more worryingly, the Scottish Green Party, which is more power in the Scottish Parliament, certainly than the English and Welsh Green Party have in the Welsh Parliament or in Westminster, they are actually now pro-nuclear, officially pro-nuclear, because they're saying that the reactors, I think there's a couple of them in Scotland, Martin, need to be extended. The life of them needs to be extended. So they're effectively now pro-nuclear, the Greens in Scotland.
Well, you could argue, once you've built something like a nuclear power station and you've spent a load of money, I think they're talking about Torness, which I went to protest against in the 1970s. And but once you've built it, the same would be true in Russia, because you've got various nuclear power stations which are already up and running. Now, even if you want to get rid of nuclear power, it doesn't make economic sense to close them all down straight away, because what you do is you run them until they come to the end of their natural life, because you've put a load of fixed cost into it. And you might as well carry on using them until they've got to be replaced.
Well, the Germans didn't do that. They just halted their program as when Fukushima happened, didn't they? The whole thing.
They did, because it's partly a political decision. And of course, the Greens look as if they're going to be the largest party in the September's general election.
Well, it was also
Germany.
The biggest protest movement in Germany was the massive anti-nuclear movement, which would shut down railway lines, which were transporting nuclear waste.
In other words, the balance of, because it's not just an economic decision, it's also a military decision and a political decision. In Germany, the Greens have basically killed off further nuclear developments in Germany, much to the disgust of the industrialists.
Anyway, let's have a listen to Allan Jeffrey now, talking about this very issue of just how green nuclear really is.
Nuclear is very carbon intensive. Now, despite what the nuclear industry tries to make out, they are in a desperate situation to try and keep governments building nuclear power stations for their businesses, their engineering, and never-ending government costs. The point is, no method of generation of electricity is zero. The only time when nuclear becomes a non-carbon producing was in the fission in the actual reactor itself. But every other part of the nuclear cycle is highly carbon intensive. From the mining, the mining, of course, thousands of tons of rock are mined to get a tiny amount of uranium out, using, of course, lots of fossil fuels. They pollute lots of the indigenous populations as they process the rock trucks to get and make the fuel, the yellow cake. And when it comes over here, there's more fossil fuels used in the processing to manufacture the fuel and to concentrate the fuel. Transport, of course, transporting across the world. And remember, if nuclear needs a constant supply of fuel. Like uranium mining goes through the whole life of the reactor. Whereas if you think of wind power, once you've built the wind turbines, or solar, once you produce them, there is no carbon dioxide production once they've been built and made. The building of the nuclear power stations takes masses and masses of produces lots and lots of carbon dioxide. Hinkley Point, they've been boasting about the amount of the biggest, largest amounts of concrete mixes. And it takes years and years to build it with concrete and steel, which does not help climate change. Because all those years it takes, and it takes decades to build a nuclear power station, they are burning fossil fuels, making the concrete, making the steel, and this takes for many, many years when you are not actually helping climate change. You're actually putting more and more carbon dioxide into the air. And what happens to the waste afterwards? When a power station comes to the end of its life, then you have masses more carbon dioxide produced as you dismantle the power stations, transport the fuel up to perhaps Sellafield, and then you've got thousands of years of looking after this high-level toxic radioactive waste. And nobody at the moment really knows what to do with that waste. We've had 60 years when all they've said is, oh, we know what to do. We'll just bury it under the ground, under this, just like Finland. Well, Finland has spent 20 years trying to do 26 kilometres of tunnels through igneous rocks because it's got 2 reactors with fuel there. No other country in the world has got as far as that, but it's taken sort of 20 odd years to get that far. And they're only just giving them permission to try and start to build the end of those tunnels now to put the radioactive waste. So you imagine all the carbon dioxide produced in the tunnelling of that. And we don't even know where we're going to put all the radioactive waste that's built up over the last 60 years. And we don't know how much it's going to be, because we don't know how many nuclear power stations. It's going to be less now because the commercial financial world is not interested now in nuclear power stations. And they're much more interested in the renewables, which are cheaper, quicker to produce, and don't produce the long-term radioactive waste, which our children are going to be left with to try and deal with the problems that we haven't solved ourselves, a technical and a huge financial black hole, which will have to come out of taxpayers. We used our taxpayers' money to build our nuclear power stations. We sold them off, some of the newer ones off cheaply to France, and now it's regretting because in the next 3 years, 6 of those reactors they bought, they hope to sort of extend the lives by another 10 years. They're giving up on now. 6 of the old British reactors won't be here in 3 years' time. They've actually started just this week. They've said that the Dungeness power stations, which have been offline for the last 2 years, through technical problems and corrosion problems, they haven't produced any electricity for the last 2 years, along with Hunterston and Hinkley Point B, of course. All those reactors with their cracking problems have been offline from at least a year each. Not producing any electricity and certainly therefore not reducing the amount of coal.
Well, it sounds, from what Alan Jeffries is saying there, Martin, first of all, that these things are most definitely not green. They are absolutely incredibly destructive to the environment. But secondly, also the whole industry is beset by massive problems. It's almost as if they'd have just carried on building the 1950s styles reactors, like the old Magnox reactors, they've probably been fine. But they're obsessed with new technologies. Oh, it's all going to be loads better. Of course, it costs something like 20 times more than one of those original ones, and it's always beset with problems.
Well, the whole decision to make nuclear power in the first place was simply, they were producing loads of radioactive waste from producing nuclear weapons, and they thought, well, let's do something with it if we're going to have it. So the economics of nuclear power are clearly bonkers. I mean, in the 1980s, the Thatcher government wanted to privatise the nuclear industry here, and I wrote a paper for the New Economics Foundation about it, and the City of London took one look at the books and said, we're not touching that with a barge pole. So the only reason why you have nuclear power is basically because of political...
It's a lobby, isn't it? It's the lobby, a bit like the Big Pharma, where there's also a nuclear lobby which makes sure it gets the decisions it wants and contracts get signed.
Don't forget that nuclear lobby is also locked into the nuclear weapons industry, so the can-do reactors...
Yeah, but is it? I mean, do we need any more plutonium, really?
No, we don't. But, I mean, I'm just going to make the point that in the 1970s, the Canadians supplied the Indians with the can-do, Canadian nuclear power reactors, and it was it was the nuclear waste from those reactors that allowed India to develop nuclear weapons. So the decision to have nuclear power is often a strategic decision to do with having access to nuclear weapons, which of course is one of the reasons why you've got all this fuss about the Iranians.
Well, the other thing is that these old power stations like the Magnox ones and Hinkley B, they have cooling pools where when the fuel rods come out of the reactor, they go and sit in a cooling pond in a flask. I think they stick them in a transport flask and then stick them in a pool of water, and it takes them a year to cool down. So at which point, after they've cooled down for a year, then they can be transported up to be reprocessed, as they call it, have the plutonium extracted from them up at Sellafield. Now, this new plant, apparently, it's going to have to be at least 20 years that the waste is going to stay on site at Hinkley, slowly cooling down in air. They're not going to put them in water, they're going to cool it in air. That is if this thing even gets off the ground. But before we get completely off the politics of all this, Martin, is it feasible, do you think, that the Chinese reactor was sabotaged? I mean, we've got this massive... Well, I mean, it's an economic war. It's a very hostile reaction from the US and its allies to China at the moment.
Well, I've got no evidence to suggest that. I mean, as you know, nuclear power is extremely iffy in its own right anyway. And therefore, I mean, certainly what happened in Iran, the attacks on their reactor are being carried out by cyber attacks, and the Israelis and the Americans have openly boasted that they did it. And of course, there's some evidence to suggest that the Stuxnet virus, which was responsible for taking down the Iranian reactor at Bushehr, was also, it leaked out onto the internet and then played a role in Fukushima. I mean, how stupid... I mean, and of course, if you take down somebody's nuclear power station...
Hang on. Just a second. Fukushima was a tsunami. It wasn't a virus.
No, but apparently there were already... The Stuxnet virus is a design virus to mess up nuclear power stations.
So coincidentally, just the same day as there was a tsunami...
because it was just weakening the systems at Fukushima. That's what the suggestion is that I've read, and that's just rumour. I haven't got any evidence to back that up. But I mean, in any case, it's pretty irresponsible to go around developing computer viruses which can take down nuclear power. But I mean, that has always been the argument against nuclear power by Greens in the first place, is that terrorists can easily, whether you like it or not, either get access to the nuclear material or by using computers or other methods, sabotage them.
Well, that's right. And in fact, in the longer interview, which I'll put up on our show page with Roy Pumphrey, and I'll put both of these interviews, the full-length versions of them, with Allan, Jeffrey and Roy Pumphrey up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. He says that nowadays they have to design these nuclear reactors with massive loads of concrete around them in order to so that even if someone flies an airliner into it, it will stand the impact of an airliner. Well, of course, that's all very well, but it's even more likely that actually a missile...
stand a missile, is it?
Yeah, a missile is more likely the thing to hit a nuclear power station than an airliner, let me suggest. And in fact, of course, these things will be targets because, of course, it will cause massive disruption in a country. It's a bit like these American air bases, Martin. Why have we got these things? They all just seem to me to be targets for in any kind of conflict. These places will be targets, and they will cause absolute mayhem in the region where they're based.
Well, not that long ago, there was a missile that was fired. I think it was from the Sinai, I think, and it didn't hit the
Dimona.
The Dimona nuclear reactor
in Israel.
But it was a shot over the bows for the Israelis, which is, don't forget, we could. So say the Iranians, for example, will certainly have the capability to hit the Dimona nuclear reactor. So they don't really need nuclear weapons to deter the Israelis. They could just fire a conventional missile at the Dimona nuclear reactor and blow it up, and they've got themselves a nuclear explosion.
Well, there's also the issue of regulation of these nuclear sites, and Allan is there. I think it was Roy, wasn't it? Was saying that he thinks that in the West the regulation of these reactors is a bit more robust, and also the press scrutiny. Although we've seen very little of the implications of this China accident for Hinkley, the press is much better over here at actually reporting it when there's a disaster, and it just doesn't happen over in China.
Well, apart from the fact that we do know about what this
because
Chinese
of the French. This is another point: is that the French company Framatome, which Roy talks about in another part of that interview, this company was the one that blew the whistle. So this is not just the Americans saying it; it's also the French partners with the Chinese at this plant over in China that have blown the whistle. So that's another indication that there really is something to see here, rather than just being US propaganda. It's a pity, isn't it, that every time we see something which is anti-China, we do, as you quite rightly pointed out, you think to yourself, oh, this is just more American propaganda. This is how important the press is in actually understanding what's going on in our world and what's happening down at Hinkley C. Anyway, so let's have a listen now to the second part of the interview with Allan Jeffrey, where he talks about something called it's a very important thing, which is part of this new Hinkley C project, which is being built at the moment, and it's called the AFD. Do you know what that is?
Alternative for Deutschland.
No. Acoustic fish deterrent. And this is a little, it's an underwater loudspeaker system which bleeps and makes bad noises that fish don't like, that make the fish swim in the wrong way, basically, because there's a whole sucking sound as millions of tons of water is dragged into this power station once it all starts up. So the acoustic fish deterrent is absolutely key in order to stop all these fish dying in the Bristol Channel. The only thing is that the company building it, EDF, are now trying to say, well, actually, we don't really want to build this acoustic fish deterrent because the fish can't really swim quick enough in order to get away from the sucking of the water. Anyway, so let's have a listen now to Allan Jeffrey. It's farcical to think that this thing is in the least bit environmental when, even me talking to anglers along the Bristol Channel anecdotally is saying that where have all the fish gone? The last 20, 30 years, all the fish have disappeared around here. But anyway, let's hear it from the lips of Stop Hinkley's Allan Jeffrey now.
The cooling system that they wanted to put in to build Hinkley C is direct cooling, where they take in vast amounts of water from the Bristol Channel and the Severn Estuary to produce this, to condense the steam, because the steam generating the reactors only produce heat. And
so how much water do they take, and how far out in the sea?
Right, because of the very, very high tides in the Severn Estuary, they have to go out they need 4 times the amount of cooling water that, say, the B station used. So to get 132 cubic meters per second, they've had to go out to the deeper waters 3 kilometres out into the Bristol Channel, whereas the B station just had 100 yards out it used to collect its water from. So they're going out 3 kilometres, and, of course, with the high tides, the young fish, when the tides go out closer to where these intake tunnels are. And that vast amount of water sucks in like a giant plug hole continuously, and it's going to be sucking in the cooling water, vast amounts over 60 years. And they reckon the conservationists reckon it's about 500,000 fish a day will be sucked into the power station. Most of them will not survive. And if you take that over the 60-year life, you're talking about 11 billion fish.
Well, couldn't they just have, say, a grill that the fish couldn't go through?
What happens is that there's 4 intake sections on the bed of the River Severn, 3 kilometres out. They drop down 30 kilometres and come down 3 kilometres back to the power station, where they hit a mesh. That mesh is a revolving cycle, so that the water goes through 5 millimetre spaces. So any eggs or larvae or anything smaller than 5 millimetres just goes straight in and is killed in the hot temperatures in the condensers. The others, once they've hit that mesh, they are very slowly carried up, and they're supposed to be dropped off into another channel, which takes them another kilometre back out to sea. So a lot of these fish being dragged and sucked with the pressure changes, the physical damage as they're being forced along these sucked along these pipes, hitting the mesh, and then being exposed to the air. Most of them will die. I mean, even EDF admits that the herrings and sprats, 90% of them will die in the process, even though they say they've got a fish recovery system.
Well, I mean, surely they could be having a kind of a fish processing plant there as well. Maybe if there's some herring or whatever, that they could just process that and sell it.
Well, if you think back to what happened with the bee station, all this fish was each week they were taking away tons of dead fish, which they went to the local dump and dumped it all. So that was fish of all many types. There's 110 different species of fish some are resident, some are and there's lots of important migratory fish that all go through the Bristol Channel up the Severn Estuary. Processing, these are future stocks of fish we're talking about here. The Severn Estuary is a breeding ground of young fish, and those young fish will grow into older fish as long as they can survive. But if they're killed when they're eggs, larvae, or as young, immature fish, then they won't be breeding in the future. So we're talking about killing off lots of future generations of fish. Normally, there's the ecological balance in the food chains, but this is an extra devastating problem, because man is sucking out continuously the marine life out of the Severn Estuary and killing it, and then throwing the dead fish or the wounded fish, which become prey again very easily for other fish. So stocks of fish over 60 years, it will have a devastating effect, especially on some of those fish which are in very low numbers at the moment.
Well, I mean, anecdotally, Alan, I've spoken to fishermen on both sides, basically the Newport side and the Minehead side, and they say that the fish stocks are very depleted, and you will find very few people actually out there, fishermen, fisherwomen, if there are such things, that they were saying that they were always very, very dissatisfied with the number of fish they're catching nowadays.
Well, this has been going on because you've had the A station and the B station, don't forget, for the last 30 years. And all the local traditional fishermen, like the sled fishermen, not far from Hinkley Point, at Stolford, they've said how all their catches have gone down 90% ever since they've had the B station, the A and the B station there, sort of thing, and they've virtually gone out of business. The traditional fishermen of the areas, and as you say, fish stocks have been going down. John May, who's been a lifelong angler on the Bristol Channel, the Severn Estuary, he is very unhappy with the amounts of young, immature fish which are just no longer about. Many years ago, there were masses of young immature fish that bred in the Severn Estuary, but because of the nuclear power stations dragging out all this cooling water and these direct cooling systems, when there are alternatives around the world, in some places, direct cooling is banned in a lot of America because of the damage to the fish stocks. The alternatives, of course, are cooling towers. So you can condense your water back again in the steam generation system with much less damaging ways all over the world. In America and over Europe, you quite often see the great big cooling towers. But for some reason, our government and EDF wanted to use direct cooling by sucking in vast amounts of water from the Severn Estuary and the Environment Agency were very concerned about this, because in 2013, when they were trying to get their planning permission to build, they had to pass an environmental impact assessment. And the Environment Agency said, your cooling system is going to have a terrible effect on the fish stocks and the marine life in the Severn Estuary. You have to use some mitigation. And they agreed in 2013 to have an acoustic fish deterrent. What that basically means is a series of loudspeakers that will send out noise so that fish, and 90% of the fish that can hear, will be put off with that noise, and they wouldn't go anywhere near where they're to be sucked into the cooling system on the intake heads. And they agreed to that in 2013 to get their planning permission to start the building. 7 years later, EDF suddenly decide, we can't afford to do it, and it's a health and safety risk. Now, this is very suspicious indeed. When they're to get their planning permission, they're trying to avoid what they were asked to do by the Environment Agency. And now what they're saying is, we've got some scientists who say, it won't be that. They've reduced the numbers of fish that they originally said were going to be killed, even with the AFD. And now they say, without the AFD, it's not really going to make much difference. They don't seem to care about trying to protect the fish species entering and being gradually reduced over many years. It's certainly not a good sign for the biodiversity of the ecology of the marine life in the Severn Estuary.
Allan Jeffrey from Stop Hinkley. Martin, I think, the maybe a month-old piles of dead fish should be thrown at the Greens that think that nuclear is green.
Well, it's not green, and it's not really economical. The reasons for having nuclear power are largely political and military, and people need to recognise that. Although I think you've also got to recognise...
Well, it's just a powerful lobby, surely. That's all it is.
Well, it's
a powerful lobby. It's not just they're just doing what they want.
It's not just a powerful lobby. The nuclear industry is a powerful lobby, of course it is, but don't forget the states will make decisions to have nuclear energy because they want nuclear weapons. And that's nothing to do with whether nuclear power pays or not, or whether it's ecological.
100 different species of fish, 500,000 fish a day sucked into this thing, and now they just don't want to bother with it. They're saying, we don't need any acoustic fish deterrent. And that was just a load of rubbish that we came out with in order to get our planning permission. We never intended to do it anyway.
Well, as you pointed out before, what may well happen with this is it simply goes bankrupt. The people have all been paid the money to pretend to build it, and they're all happy, and the companies concerned go bankrupt, and everybody walks away and says, what was that all about?
Well, last year we had Dr. Chris Busby on this show saying that he thinks that actually big projects like this aren't about achieving anything and building anything. They're just about the money that goes into people's pockets before the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, I mean, Keynes in the 1930s talked about the whole idea of digging holes to fill them with bottles with £10 notes in, and then burying them and having other people coming and digging them up, because that keeps the economy primed. So in a sense, infrastructure spending, especially if it doesn't succeed and you don't end up killing all the fish, you just spent a load of money, which then, keeps everybody on the payroll for the money perfectly happy.
And isn't it interesting how what you were saying there about the cooling towers? Well, if you have a couple of cooling towers at Hinkley C instead of this massive amount of water that you're continually taking in and spewing back out into the Bristol Channel, then you don't need to take anywhere near as much water. All you do is the water cools down in the cooling towers. But of course, that might be considered, it's actually a physical eyesore, and we don't really want to look at it here. That's probably the reason I would have thought why we're not building cooling towers is because they will have all sorts of trouble with planning, because it doesn't look very nice right next to the Quantux, the site of special scientific interest.
Well, that may well be so.
Outstanding natural beauty with cooling towers.
So you can have no cooling towers and no fish, or cooling towers and fish.
Anyway,
maybe neither.
Roy Pumphrey and who was that I spoke to then? Anyway, both of them will be on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. Full report there on the what seems to me increasingly likely demise of the great flagship nuclear power station being built in Britain right now, with something like 4,000 people working every day on something that might maybe never happen at all. Ultimately, Martin, what do you think is going to happen to the nuclear power industry? And you did this report for the New Economics Foundation years ago. Did you see this potential grinding to a halt finally happening?
Yeah. I mean, we're already spending quite a large proportion of taxpayers' money. I think it's 2p in the pound on income tax, something like that, to look after our existing nuclear waste pile. So you can see that the nuclear industry and the nuclear weapons industry is going to be a big black hole eating up resources for generations to come. And at a certain point, one of the things that may happen, of course, if you have a big crash in the mainstream economy, is that these projects really just become non-viable. And they may be non-viable even if the economy doesn't crash. So the most likely outcome is that it will gradually be run down. Countries which have already committed to having nuclear power stations, they've got them up and running, they will carry on running them because there's no point just closing them down for the hell of it. But when they come to the end of their life, I think it's quite likely that the nuclear industry will die a long and prolonged death, just like the rest of the planet, I suppose.
Okay, we're going to go and look at some local stories now. But before we have our main one, which is about the police action, bullying, threatening, beating up action against the squatters and the travellers, really preempting this whole Priti Patel police state bill back on the Tuesday the 23rd of March this year. In Bristol City Council, Martin, the councillors are raising fears about a big revamp of the health and care services. What is a white paper? I didn't realise that local authorities brought these out, but apparently they do. A new